Welcome back to another wonderful episode with Rabbi Pinchas Winston, a live webinar. We usually are here every Thursday. Today we decided to switch it up to Wednesday. I hope that it's not confusing too many people. But of course, everyone's going to join, because who would not join an amazing webinar entitled Kabbalah 101, right? This is where you're going to learn the basics of Jewish mysticism. Everyone, I'm sure, is going to want to join this. Let me just start by saying that Rabbi Winston has a website. It is 36.org. We encourage everyone to go there and purchase his books and see about his lectures, his upcoming lectures there. And this webinar is sponsored by the Bring Them Home project, which can be found at israeltorah.org. And we also want to encourage all of our listeners to go to our YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/Israel Torah. And there we would very much appreciate if you can sign up, if you can subscribe, and you can press on the notification so you can hear more great information like Rabbi Winston is about to give us. Without further ado, Rabbi Winston.
Thank you. Just for the record, the 101 is how much I charge for this class, okay? But anyhow, the tomorrow night, God willing, is Lag BaOmer. That's what we switched the class to tonight. A lot of people make bonfires, big bonfires, and barbecue. There's fire involved in that too. And not everyone really focuses on what the importance of the day itself. So just briefly, there's basically two major events that took place in Lag BaOmer. According to many opinions, we know that the students of Rabbi Akiva had begun to die at the beginning of the Omer, which is the second day of Pesach, and they continued to die until the 32nd day, or the beginning of the 33rd day of the Omer. They stopped dying, and therefore became a day of relief and somewhat celebration. I can't say celebration because all the people had 24,000 students had died. So I'm sure no one celebrated, but certainly it was a relief that they stopped dying at that point in time. We spoke about last week somewhat why that was an issue, why so many people had died that time. But one of the main reasons why Lag BaOmer is a day of celebration, also to do with a death, but in a different way. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai also died on Lag BaOmer, but it's kind of a celebration of his life, because that was the day that he revealed basically the contents of the Zohar to 10 trusted students, and it became the base of the Zohar we have today, which wasn't officially published until the 1300s, but the material existed the entire time. He was not mechadish the material. He didn't make it up. It wasn't like, it didn't exist before. Moshe knew it from God at Mount Sinai. It was a tradition going all the way back to Mount Sinai, but it was a secret tradition. It was something that was passed on from generation to generation to people who were worthy to learn it, because it's not like learning Mishnah or Talmud or Chumash for that matter. They're all holy areas of learning, but you can learn them even if you're not on a very high spiritual level. Kabbalah is very different. The leap from Chumash, which is the reading of the verses of the Torah itself on the most basic level, perhaps even with Rashi, who explains it, is to Mishnah, which is the recording of the terse statements of the oral law that was supposed to remain oral, but persecution and assimilation and various different things forced the rabbis to make a monumental historic decision to actually record it. But they made a point of maintaining the verbal nature of it, that it should not become too much of a written body of law. And so they record it in very terse statements of required elucidation, explanation, specifically in the base medrash where they spoke about these things. And these discussions basically are the basis of the Talmud, but at the beginning in 186 CE, the time of the Romans, that the Talmud did not exist. It was not recorded for another about 300 years until 499 CE, Common Era, when they finally wrote the Talmud down. That's what we're learning basically today. But the leap from Chumash to Mishnah is not huge. It was not so significant. From Mishnah to Talmud is already a bigger leap. And one of the reasons why is because the Talmud itself is written in Aramaic for the most part, And Aramaic is not a mother tongue. Back then it was. Back at the time that the Talmud was actually recorded, so people did speak Aramaic, and it was recorded in that language. Even the Jerusalem Talmud, which was recorded and written down in Eretz Israel, also is written in Aramaic as well at the same time. And it's more difficult to learn. You have to learn how to learn it first. You could open it up. I mean, today, I'll tell you, just open up an Art Scroll Gemara today. Art Scroll went ahead and they basically, they translated the Talmud to English and provided a lot of commentaries. And anybody who's learned the Art Scroll Talmud knows that one folio page of Talmud could take 3 or 4 pages before you get to the next side. You just see the same page over, but the translation continues on, and so do the commentaries. And the reason why it takes so much information is because it's so terse and it's so elusive in many different ways, and you have to first learn how to learn it. And even just reading the words doesn't necessarily mean exactly what you're reading, because there are nuances and there's tricks of the trade, so to speak. So a lot of people spend a lot of time first learning how to learn the Talmud before they actually learn the Talmud at the same time. So there's a leap, but the leap from Talmud to Kabbalah is huge. And even though Kabbalah, the Zohar, for example, which is the main repository of Kabbalistic ideas, is also written in Aramaic, anybody who's learned Talmud will have a difficult time reading the Zohar, because it'll look like a whole different, language of Aramaic. You can see similarities, obviously, but of course it's more than that. There's a whole different vocabulary, there's a whole different mindset. The Talmud builds on the Mishnah builds on the Chumash, but the Zohar, Kabbalah, seems to build on itself. It will always refer back to verses or a Gemara or a Mishnah, but it is complicated. Many people have opened up the Zohar and said, this is not for me, and they've closed it again. Today, thank God, we have some excellent commentaries on the Zohar to explain things on more basic levels, but even the commentaries assume a certain amount of background information. So, this goes back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who revealed it in this day, and the Zohar talks about what it was like. It was like fire. I mean, I don't know if there was physical fire surrounding his home, but spiritual fire, and the angels came down to listen. A lot of drama involved in the relating of the Zohar, and when he was finished, he died. Now, what's amazing is that we're celebrating the revelation of the Zohar by people who, for the most part, may never look at it or even want to look at it. I've been told by many people when I've asked them, they've asked me and I've asked them, and no, Kabbalah is not for me. It's not an area of learning that I'm interested in or I can get into, basically. And these are people that have been learning for years, maybe decades, and they have a good grasp of the more revealed aspects of Torah. But the Arizal in Shar HaGilgulim, which is the book of reincarnations, mentions that everybody has to learn all 4 levels, and you keep coming back as a reincarnation until you do. And you have to hire a teacher. If you can't do it on your own, you have to hire a teacher to teach you these things, because it's part of the shleimus, the completion of a person. If I had more time, I'd go into it in more details. I do have books on the topic. Anybody wants to read it inside, you can order the book online. And anyhow, there's lots and lots and lots of sites that talk about these ideas, but I'm just going to focus the time we have today on just a basic background. The story goes, according to the Talmud, during the time of the Romans, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a student of Rabbi Akiva, and it was the time of the Romans had edicts like you can't learn Torah, you can't teach Torah in public, that's for sure. If you do, you get caught, then you get killed, and sometimes in the worst way possible. Crucifixion was a major way, and burning. They would wrap someone in the Sefer Torah and burn them together. They were torturous people. They knew how to make their point about how much they didn't want you to do something, but didn't stop a lot of heroic people from taking the risk and taking the chance. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was, of course, doing this, but he also one day spoke, derogatorily about the Roman government, the Roman Empire, and unfortunately, he did it amongst with someone in the room who was supposed to be trusted but wasn't, and he ran off and he snitched on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and that forced him into hiding. He and his son, Rabbi Elazar. And they went together, and they hid in the base medrash. And for a while, his wife was secretly bringing him food to help to sustain them. But he realized that was dangerous because, God forbid, if the Romans were to capture his wife and torture her, she might reveal their whereabouts, and therefore it wasn't safe. And therefore, they ran off and they hid in a cave. And it says a miracle happened. A stream of water, came by them, and a carob tree grew for them, and they were sustained for 12 years off this stream of water and this charuv tree, this carob tree. And to deal with the heat, they would bury themselves in the dirt, up to their necks to remain cool because it was very hot, and they come out at nighttime, and it caused all kinds of bodily issues for them, which raises certain questions how that could happen. They have a miracle of this, one the miracle of that. So that's part of a different topic, but it's not a contradiction in any way. And they learned, and they came out after 12 years, and they were so intense with their understanding of Kabbalah that when they first saw somebody plowing his field and not involved in the learning of Kabbalah, he gazed at this person, and it says he became a heap of bones. Now, I don't know if that means physically or spiritually, but he became a heap of bones. And a baskol, a voice came out from Shemaim and said, it's not for this reason. I didn't bring you out of the cave to destroy my world. Go back in one more year. And they go back in for another year. They come in after the 13th year, and it's a whole different story. Now they look at the world and they see things differently. The number 13 is very significant, always alludes to God's oneness, alludes to Rachamim, 13 attributes of mercy. And instead of burning up the world, they were more sympathetic. Somehow, in the course of that extra year of learning, they developed a even more profound understanding that made them more merciful as opposed to more judgmental. And then they came out. They apparently the edict had been over. They were no longer in danger, and they lived happily after until the end of their life, teaching Kabbalah. And there's all kinds of accounts of the teaching of Kabbalah. Now, what is it? Obviously, it's mysticism. Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism. You look up online, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And what does it teach? What's its value? People think about mysticism, they think about the supernatural. And the truth is, there are two aspects of Kabbalah. There's what you would call, let's say, theoretical Kabbalah. There's what you call practical Kabbalah, meaning that practical is kind of a funny word, but there's like the knowledge itself, the learning, the understanding, which we'll talk about in a second. And practical Kabbalah is that more supernatural application where you read about stories of Rechini ben Dosa, who was able to turn rags into challahs, or it happened for him, or to find jewels all of a sudden, to become rich, to take care of his parnasa, or Choni Amagal talking to God and getting to all kinds of Kabbalistic things, miracles. But you think of miracles, you think about God does them for you, and He does. That's where miracles come from. But the Leshem, Rav Shlomo Eliashiv says, in the time of the Second Temple, God gave the keys of miracles over to the Tanaim. Those were the rabbis and the leaders of the generation at that time who recorded the Mishnah, and the likes of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and all these different rabbis, and they knew how to perform miracles. Now, how do they do that? They use Kabbalah. Kabbalah allows you to perform miracles. Now, what does it mean? You wiggle your nose or something? Some kind of incantation, abracadabra, which means as you said. What did they do to perform miracles? So the truth is, once upon a time, it was a lot more difficult to discuss Kabbalistic ideas with people who did not have much background. You had to build up to the understanding. You had to get used to certain concepts and ideas that were all very abstract. But over the course of hundreds of years, technology has kicked in, and technology is basically a harnessing of the attributes of the physical world for the sake of making our lives more comfortable, easier, more functional, more productive. And what's interesting about the technology is that basically the physical world, we are told and we are taught, mimics and shadows the spiritual world. The spiritual world is invisible. We can't see it. So how do we know how it works? Well, partly through the theory, that God passed, down to Moshe, and he passed down all generations after that, which becomes the learning of Kabbalah itself. But another way, and more recently, is because since the physical world is just a projection of the spiritual world, it tends to function similarly to the spiritual world. So you can actually reverse engineer, in a sense, by looking at the physical world and draw all kinds of information, conclusions, and analogies that help you understand the spiritual world. So, for example, electricity, a wonderful thing. We're just so dependent upon it that if it shuts down, all of a sudden, what's it, freak out? How can I survive? How can I live? And in fact, I once read that if, God forbid, there was an EMP attack on a place like, for example, the United States of America, shouldn't happen, right? But if it did happen, electromagnetic pulse attack on America, which can happen by a nuclear bomb exploding 40 miles into the air, and above a country, it basically knocks out the electrical system, the electrical grid, not just like a blackout where you just go fix a few wires and put it back on again, but it causes a whole problem with the electrons and all that. And within weeks, like 90% or a very high number of people would die. Just, it's astounding. Hundreds of millions of people. Why? Because a whole country runs by electricity. It's not just that you turn your computer on, there's electricity. It's more than that. All the food that you eat depends upon electricity, processes. We have hundreds of millions of people, billions of people in the world to feed. And it's not like things just grow and you just take them, from to the ground to the market. It's nice if you can do a thing like that, but a lot of the food is processed, and a lot of food has to be stored for maybe even for a month, 2 months. They have to build it up and then bring it to the cities and all that. Requires refrigerators, and backup systems, and the whole computer system that regulates and controls it, the water system, the sewage system. All these things all depend upon electricity, and if it all shuts down, you can't fix it in a short time. Most catastrophes take place, in a way that they can be fixed in a relatively short time. There's a certain inconvenience, but not so destructive. Hospitals require electricity to keep people alive. So, it's an amazingly powerful thing that we depend upon. And we figured out how to use it, even though energy basically is something we don't really understand that much. It's just there in the world. We learn to harness it. We're pretty good about figuring out how to use that source of power in a very productive way. So you're stuck with the problem. The problem is basically that energy is affected by things like friction. So in order for energy to travel, we have things like wireless technology today, but it still requires a certain amount of wiring, in the walls and to bring it from a power source. It's not like Niagara Falls or whatever source we're using wirelessly sends its energy to cities. It goes through wires and thick wires and thin wires and transformers and power plants and things like that. And eventually in your house, maybe something's wireless. But the source, your modem, is plugged into the wall, as is your computer, as is the wire that charges your phone. So the trouble is, because since electrons are physical and they are affected by things like friction, so as they go through the wires, they wear down and they slow down. So what happens eventually, you may not notice it after 5 feet or 15 feet or even 100 feet, but after miles and miles and miles of cable, eventually it becomes so weak that if it starts off relatively normal, the current, right, and you go a mile with it, by the time it gets to the other side, you barely have any electricity at all, if any electricity at all. So how do we run that problem? So what we do is we create a huge source of electricity, and we use that to send out to the surrounding areas. We have all kinds of mathematical and engineering calculations about how many houses you can supply with how much energy based upon the type of fuses. It's all mathematical. It's all algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a power grid to try and control it. You see that sometimes we can't control it perfectly, completely, and there's brownouts and there's even blackouts. Even as modern as the technology is today, it still happens, especially in the hot, the summertime, when all these air conditioners are blasting away, or in the winter when all these heaters are blasting away. But in the meantime, you have to start with a huge source of electricity, which might be a nuclear power plant, or you have a waterfall that's very powerful that can turn a wheel and turns a turbine and creates, generates electricity. And then you have these massive cables that take that electricity and to perhaps some kind of power station that's built to receive that level of power, but then it goes shipped out to other places, other power, smaller local power plants in smaller cables and transformers, and they work with the wiring, they work with the air, they work with all kinds of factors that affect the flow of those electrons to try to regulate it. By the time it gets to your house, you can plug your hair blower in or your Cuisinart or whatever you're using without blowing it up or causing yourself to blow up in the process. Now, if you plug your toaster oven into Niagara Falls or some nuclear power plant, if indeed it was possible, then there would be a problem. Not only would you fry your appliance, but you probably fry yourself at the same time. God forbid, but that's, so we have all kinds of fences. Even in my small community here, they have these thin little, power, towers, like electrical towers made from metal with spikes around them saying, dangerous, you can die if you climb this and go past this point, because they're not such thick wires, but the power is still pretty powerful. I remember as a boy learning the hard way what happens if you stick a bobby pin, for example, into a plug socket. That just seemed fascinating to do a thing like that until I did it. And basically the shock was tremendous, blew the house, and sent me about halfway across the room. It's just a plug, and you just plug anything else in and you get electricity and it works beautifully. But it's got to be all, fit together. So that's how it works. Electricity. You start with a big source, you filter the light as it goes on, eventually gets to an outlying community, to your office building, to your house, and it becomes manageable. Why is that such an important point of this discussion? Because it's a fantastic analogy for what Kabbalah comes to teach. And what is that? We get the same problem. Moshe Rabbeinu, right? The great Moshe Rabbeinu is on top of Mount Sinai. The Jewish people have sinned with the golden calf. And he's now been up there, this is he was up there for one set of 40 days. And for the second set of 40 days, he begged for forgiveness from God that he shouldn't destroy the Jewish people. And when God finally says in the third set of 40 days, okay, I forgive him, and gives him a new set of tablets. So Moshe figures this is a good time to talk to God. He's in a good mood. You go to your father to ask for the keys or allowance, or your boss for a raise when they're in a good mood. You don't go on a bad day. So Moshe says, this is a time that's propitious to ask important questions. I want to understand. So Moshe says to God, show me your glory. I want to understand you in such a high and sophisticated level of understanding. And God says to Moshe, no man can see my face, because no man can see my face and live. In other words, there's no way I can fulfill your request on the level that you're asking. Because if I expose, you're not going to see something physical. We're not talking physical. We're talking about in the brain, a revelation of an understanding, which seems like totally, easy to deal with. But no, it's not. It's high level light. And God says to Moshe, if I were to give you that level of exposure, you would die. Your body, your circuits just wouldn't handle it. The same way, for example, if you get a power surge, boom, the thing, it blows. You would have a power surge, a spiritual power surge. So we learn from this, and actually before this, that God's light really is far too intense for the average human being to be able to grasp. It's worse than that, or better, depends how you look at it. God's light is so intense, it's impossible for anything else to exist, let alone a physical world, let alone a human being with free will who can decide whether he believes in God or not. I mean, God's light is like it's not even Niagara Falls, can't even talk about it, but it's so overwhelming and so powerful that if you were to be exposed to God's light on its purest level, well, there's no sense even talking about it, because you couldn't exist in the first place to be able to be exposed to it. But if you did exist and he opened it up all of a sudden, this is actually one of the forms of death called nashika. When God takes righteous people, he actually exposes them to a much higher level of life than their body can handle, but it's the best way to go. Ecstasy. The body has an elevation, it's purified, the soul gets drawn out like someone in love, because it's just a phenomenally magnetic level of love. But we're still stuck with a problem because God wants man to exist. And God wants man to have free will, not just man to exist, but to have free will. That he or she can choose to live a moral life and earn reward in the world to come, which is going to be eternal after this world and history is finally over, after the 6,000 years of history. So you have a dilemma. On one hand, everything is made from God's light. It's infinite. Nothing can exist outside of it. A fundamental of Jewish belief and faith is that everything is a function of God's will. You can't exist without God's will. You can't. His light is the basis of everything. If God's light's not there, if he withdraws it, that thing ceases to exist immediately. Boom, just like that. It can't it's not like a dead body where someone dies, God pulls back the soul, and the body remains. The body remains because God's light's still in the body. He's leaving the body there. And over time, as he pulls back the light, the body will decay and disappear for natural reasons, to make life look more natural. But if God were to pull back that light immediately, boom, just like that thing disappear. Because nothing can exist without the light of God. So it's infinite, and we're finite. And not only are we finite, but we have to live in a world where God's light's so withdrawn that we can actually question whether God exists or not. So we can make free will decisions. It's not called free will if it's so apparent that God exists that you can't get around it. You can't deny it. That's the Messianic era. That's how God kills the Yetzer Hara at the end of days. He shechs the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination of man, and there's no longer any more free will. He doesn't just yank it out of the body. Watch this, everybody. Boom. Doesn't do that. We're not talking about chickens over here, right? Instead, what he does is just exposes the world to his light, and everybody sees it. It opens up like at Yam Suf, at the splitting of the sea, where even a simple handmaid saw things that the prophets in the future were going to see because God revealed that light to the world. So, if God's light's so apparent, that's like someone putting a gun to your head and saying, your money, your life, but don't let the gun bother you. Don't let the gun interfere in your free will choices. You decide for yourself. How can you ignore the gun? The gun is there. In fact, that's one of the explanations they give for why it says at Mount Sinai that God held the mountain over the heads of the Jewish people and said, do you want my Torah or not? And the mountain's like overhead. And if you do accept my Torah, I'll put the mountain back where it belongs. If you don't, I'll put it back on top of you. And we're all done. That's it for you guys. So, so how's that free will? How's that free will? How can we be praised for saying we will do and understand later on if God put the mountain over our heads? So the explanation given is that the mountain wasn't actually picked up, but it was as if it was, because the revelation of God at Mount Sinai was so intense. There was no need to question, does God exist? Does he not exist? Does he run? It's like every. But Yomahu Yeshem Echad U'Shmo Echad. That's what Zechariah said, how he describes in the days. On that day, God will be one, be king over the entire land. He'll be one, and his name will be one. So so what do? You've got two opposing realities. You got the reality of God, which is everywhere at all times. You can't get around it. It's infinite and it's powerful, and nothing physical can exist. And you need a physical world where man can exist and have free will and even deny God if he chooses to, and be paid for that later on. So how does it work? So the same thing we do with electricity. Electricity, we have the source of the power, and we have where it has to go to, and then we create what's called a malreches, a system in between that takes the power, right? When I walk into my house and I flick a light switch on, it's a system. I expect the light to go on. By flicking the switch, it closes the circuit. The electrons can now flow through the wire, goes to the light, right, and turns the light on. It's a system. So likewise, God created a system, a malreches, to be able to take his light and filter it. Now, that's a concept that requires a lot of thought. Even then, it's hard to understand. But that's what happens. That much we know. How it happens, that's a discussion to itself. That it happens, that much we know, because we're living proof of that. The fact that the world can exist the way it does, and there's free will, and people are able to even deny the reality of God, shows you the system works, and perfectly. And that light basically has to be filtered from the top, the source of that light, and goes level by level. And as it does, some of the light gets held back, and some of the light continues on. The next level, held back, right? And all the way down until eventually the light's so filtered that you can have people exist and people have free will. The light gets stepped down. Just like with electricity, it works the exact same way in the spiritual world. Or should we say the other way around? Just like in the spiritual world, you have the system of filters and transformers and things like that. Likewise, we do the same thing with electricity in the physical, because that's where it started. Down here, it just came along later on and duplicated the system in a physical way. What do we call those transformers? What do we call those devices that God created to filter his light, to make it that we can exist? So, to begin with, even though they do result in the physical world, by definition, they are spiritual. Every single device that God uses to filter his light, by definition, is spiritual. And they're basically round, and the reason why they're round is because the entire shell in which they exist is round, just like the earth is round, right? Likewise, the crust, everything's like the same way. Same thing true is that in the spiritual realm, which is way, way bigger, the physical world that we live in, the whole entire universe is just a drop, a pinhead, if that even, of the entire existence of creation that goes way beyond the physical world, which happens to be inside of a shell, which happens to be round. So therefore, everything inside it also is round. So the actual devices, if you will, that God created specifically in order to be able to allow this light to come down and be filtered are called spheres. Right now we're doing what's called spheres of Omer, the counting of the Omer. It's a very specific mitzvah that began back in Pesach time, will end by Shavuos time, God willing. The word lispor means to count. But there's different definitions of the word sphere. Even the English word sphere, which means round, something round, a ball, probably more than likely comes from the word sphera, because they are round like balls, but they're spiritual balls. And they have this capacity to receive light, filter it exactly as God prescribes, and then pass it on to the next level to do exactly what he has to do along the way down. It's just a way for God to continuously transfer his light from its source, where it's completely unmanageable for man, down to us, where we can use it, and it expresses the will of God. And these spheres have names, and the reason why they're called a sphere also because just like they're measures of light. So it's like it's what we call ball. It's bordered, and even though God's light's infinite, somehow they can contain the infinite light, just like your body contains your spiritual soul. How does a physical, creation, how is it able to be the casing for a soul? Well, the same thing is over here. It's a miracle of life. It's a miracle as well as up in the spheres too. So they are also called midos for that reason, because they're a certain measure of God's light, and they have names. They have names that basically express the will of God and express the traits of God. In general, there are 10 spheres, and this is the basis of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is constantly discussing and working with a concept called spheres, of which there are 10. And their names are Keser, which means crown, because it sits on the top like a crown. Chachma, which means wisdom, but it's actually more like abstract knowledge, because the light is knowledge. All of God's light, every aspect is knowledge. The knowledge is from his light. There's more external light and more internal, more spiritual light, but it's the same idea. The light and knowledge, what are the same thing? So Chachma is the knowledge on a very abstract level that we have a very difficult time relating to. But the light travels on to the next level called Bina, which means understanding, because the light's becoming more tangible, becoming more accessible. It will result in knowledge that we can relate to. There's another sphere called Das, but we won't go into that one right now, because as central and important as it is, it's too long of a discussion right now. The next level after that is called Chesed, which means kindness. And it's basically, there's different reasons why, but one of the main reasons why is because this makes possible life. At this point in time, by the time the light gets a level of kindness, of chesed, we're already at a stage where physical creation can exist. And God can't, the verse in Tehillim says, right, Olam chesed yibane, a world of chesed you created, a world from chesed you created as well. This is a verse that the Kabbalists use all the time. And the next one's called gevura, which means strength, because in order for the light to go down further, it has to be constricted. We call it tzimtzum, and therefore the light's being held back even more so. But the positive aspect of that is that creation can exist, that we can have free will. The negative aspect is that God's light's more hidden, and therefore you can have what's called hester panim, the hiding of God's face, the judgment, the flood, the Holocaust. All kinds of things can happen because the light's being it's constrained. And the next level is called tiferes, which is a balance basically between the chesed, which is one extreme, which is Avram, for example, and the gevur, which is Yitzchak, who is judgment. And you balance these two together, you get Yaakov Avinu called tiferes, which means harmony, right? Beauty, because balance is where it's at. The next one's called Netzach, and Netzach means dominance, and a little more complicated to go into, corresponds to Moshe Rabbeinu. And then comes Hod, which corresponds to Aaron HaKohen, which is glory, basically. We know that Aaron was the glory of the Jewish people because he's the Kohen Gadol. He represents that spiritual perfection. And then comes, after that, you have the sphere of Yesod, which means foundation, which corresponds to Yosef. And finally, you have Malchus, which is kingdom, which corresponds to David HaMelech. And each of these spheres have their specific names because they represent the level on that level and what it's doing to create creation and then maintain and sustain creation. That's the basic idea. Now, the amazing thing is you only have these 10 spheres, and yet all of this exists. The variety is unbelievable. Zillions of things exist because of these 10 spheres that filter God's light and express his will and actualize what he wants to happen with us interacting with it. So another analogy really is, in a sense, the periodic table, right? We have the periodic table, which last I knew, I think has 118 elements in it. It's much more than when I was in school, but 118 known elements in the periodic table, which sounds like a lot, but when you consider what those things are responsible for in the physical world, the whole universe is made up of these elements, and there's just so many. I mean, it's uncountable. How many things exist because of 118 elements? Well, how does that work? Well, you just open up a chemistry book and it shows you. It's all a bunch of equations or diagrams that show you how different molecules are made up of different parts, different elements, and how you arrange them results in different creations, different things. So these permutations and combinations can create everything that exists in the physical world. There might be some elements we still haven't found yet, but nonetheless, we've come a long way with 118 elements to explain the basis of physical creation. So the exact same thing is true in terms of the spheres. You only have 10 spheres, but each of those 10 spheres have 10 spheres. And each of the 10 spheres of the 10 spheres have 10 spheres. The exact same system replicating itself on another level. Obviously, they get smaller and smaller and smaller as you go down. But it's almost as if there's an infinite amount of subsets of spheres. Yeah, 10 general ones, but then there's more specific ones, and then more specific ones, and then more specific ones, and more specific, until you have basically a sphere for everything that exists, for every moment of history that passes, because a moment, boom, goes like that. But every moment is a function of energy, which is spiritual. And this is what Kabbalah basically discusses. Spheres and partzufim. Partzufim literally means face, right? So how does that apply over here? So you look, it's interesting because we can see the exact same kind of concept in a family setup. When you were growing up as one child as a family, for example, my last name is Winston, right? And I grew up as a Winston. I was one Winston amongst my 6 people in my family. But then I got married, Baruch Hashem, and I have a family of my own. So now I have the exact same thing that I grew up in, I have for myself as well. So in a sense, but this is more, when I was just one of 6 in another family, and I wasn't the father, the husband, the balabayas, right? So then I got lost in the shuffle. I had my own personality, I had my own life, but I was one of a unit. But now that the unit belongs to me, so to speak, so this unit's more of an expression of me, of my personality, my who I am as a person, for better or for worse. Some would argue for worse, some would argue for better. But this is the idea of Partzufim as well, that somehow when the sphere is one of 10, it's just part of the family of 10. It's got its own independent nature and character, but you only get to know it really well when you look at it as an individual set of 10 spheres called the Partzuf. And if you look in the Arizal, and you look in Eitz Chaim, for example, one of the main works of the Arizal, and other Sforim that talk about the technical aspect of Kabbalah, for example, in the Zohar has different parts to it, but the main part is just a commentary, a deep, more profound commentary on the Chumash. But then you get to a section, for example, called Sifat Itznusa, or Idra Rabbah, or Jazuta, or Medrash Nelam, and all of a sudden the conversation changes. They may make references back to the Chumash and verses and Psukim, which is always very fascinating how it does that, to see how a simple verse is really an expression of a very deep Kabbalistic idea. But all of a sudden they start talking about the spheres and the light that's moving around, and how it creates this and results in this Partzuf and that sphere and that Partzuf, and how that eventually gets manifested in history. So this might require a part 2, right? This is really Kabbalah 101. We might have to look at 102 or maybe even 201, God willing, in the future. But the basic idea is, someone were to sum up, ask me, what is the value in learning Kabbalah? Because apparently the Zohar thinks very highly of itself, and not because it thinks highly of itself, but it says, for example, that anybody who learns the Eitz Chaim, it's a euphemism for Kabbalah, anyone learns it, will be spared the anguish of the birth pangs of Mashiach and the war of Gog and Magog. But anybody else will have to go through them. Now, that's a very big promise to make, and it's very appealing that someone who's not learning Kabbalah should become interested just for that reason alone. The question is why? Why does it make a difference which area of learning I focus on, as long as I'm doing it sincerely and as profoundly as I possibly can? What's the difference specifically by Kabbalah that it saves me from those terrible, potentially terrible times that other areas of learning, including the Talmud, which we see from the Holocaust, does not protect you from necessarily? So basically, we'll use another analogy to make it shorter, but it's very much like the digestive system, if you will. Right? The digestive system is also very miraculous, at least to a person who doesn't understand biology and how the body works. You put food into your mouth, you chew it, you swallow it, and that's it. You figure that's it. You're done. You don't think about it. Obviously, to take care of your bodily needs, there's things that you have to do, but we don't even connect it so much with the eating process. It's almost like it's a whole different activity. It's just part of being human. But what's going on inside the body is absolutely remarkable. You have enzymes breaking down the food. Certain foods faster than others. Certain foods are healthier. Certain are antioxidants, right? That's the word. That help you against things like cancer. Other foods, God forbid, can cause things like that. And we just put it in our mouth and don't think about it. But the biologist and the dietitian, they know what's going inside the body, what the processes are, what helps the process, what prevents the process. If a person really, really takes the time, and should take the time, not just to know which foods are healthy, but why they're healthy, why these foods make a difference to your body and your health and how you feel. And you can go even further. We can talk about how that works Kabbalistically, because diet is only one part of the process. There's a reason why such diets work well and other diets don't work well. I don't mean in terms of losing weight. I'm talking in terms of health and overall health. And it's the same idea. If a person understands how the body works, they can spare themselves a lot of the anguish that comes later on in life when you have to deal with all the fallout from your bad eating habits when you were younger, or even as you're older. That inside information about how the body works frees you up, in a sense, A lot of people, if they knew what smoking does to their lungs, you can't see it at the moment. You can't even feel it at the moment. But down the road, it shows up. I wish I never started smoking, many people will say. Or I wish I hadn't eaten like that when I was younger. Or I wish I didn't eat so much on Shabbos. Because later on it shows up. And when it shows up later on, the problems can be horrific, terrible. I mean, people need operations sometimes to solve the problem. And it's all because people don't take the time to understand how their bodies work. Because if they did, they would be more cautious, more careful, have more power against the Yetzer Hara to eat properly and take care of themselves. Because it's just not worth the cost down the road. Teeth the same way, brushing, flossing, the whole thing. If you know and you understand what's going on, you can't always see it, but the knowledge alone can change everything. The same thing is true of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is an inside look at the inner workings of creation on such a sublime and profound level. When a person understands what's going on in the world, that everything is a function of tikkun, of rectification, personal rectification, national, international, the world, the universe, it's all rectification. It never stops. You can go to sleep. You can think you're stopping. You can take a vacation. But rectification doesn't. It's ongoing, nonstop. And that's what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai opened up for us. He gave us a glimpse at a world that people didn't understand what was going on. They were just living, not fully aware of what their actions were causing for themselves and the world in general. And now he made it accessible. And over the years, the technology became more available and more understandable. So we gained even greater insights into how we can affect the world and ourselves vis-a-vis Kabbalah. And that insight is crucial for being able to make decisions today about what we're doing and how we're living and where we should be going. Unfortunately, Jewish history is a witness to the fact that the Jewish people have been caught off guard so many times. We stayed too long in Galus, in exile, or one place, or one exile, or we got involved in activities we shouldn't have, or we didn't take serious our learning as we might have, and mitzvahs not up to par, because we don't understand, we don't see the effects. But if a person understands what's going on in the world on a spiritual level, has that appreciation, it's a game changer. It's a paradigm shift. And I can tell you, we like to end off, this show somewhat talking about Eretz Yisrael and Aliyah and things like that, but it's not hard because this is exactly what it's all about. Eretz Yisrael, in a sense, is the land of Kabbalah because it's the place that you come closer to Kodesh Baruch Hu. That's what he said. That's what the Torah says. The Gemara says. The Medrash says. The whole point of Kabbalah is the same as all of Torah, to bring you closer to Hashem. But it's a higher rung. It's a greater revelation of God himself. But the most amazing thing about Eretz Yisrael is you get that just from being here on some level you can't get anywhere else in the world. And therefore, even the connection to Kabbalah, the learning itself, the Gemara says, just by breathing in the air, you become wiser. Literally, just the air itself. What about in Tel Aviv, where it's more polluted? We didn't say you become physically healthier, just become wiser. Probably to move someplace else where the air is cleaner. But the basic idea is the air is a Kabbalistic concept. And it means that since the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is here, it's much more stronger than anywhere else in the world, your ability to access higher levels of Torah are going to be much easier and much more accurate in Eretz Yisrael. And that Kabbalah proves clearly. So it's Kabbalah 101. Barely that. There's so much more to discuss. But it just seemed appropriate with Lag BaOmer coming up tomorrow night, God willing, that we have at least some focus, some idea, a little bit, an inkling somewhat of what it's all about. Anyhow, we should have a amazing Lag BaOmer, should be insightful, and we should see this year the redemption in full, God willing, and Shabbat Shalom.
Amen. Do you want to mention to our listeners what is the schedule for next week? We're switching back to Thursday.
Thursday, 8:30, Bezrat Hashem, yes.
And 8:30 Israel Standard Time. We look forward to seeing you there. Again, we encourage everyone to go to the Rabbi's website, 36.org, and also to visit the Bring Them Home organization's website, which is israeltorah.org, and to subscribe and click on the notifications of the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Israel Torah. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. Good night.